Dan McClellan responded to my video, but before I get to that question he asked of me at the end, I'm going to go through his two-part response and respond to various points.
All right, let's see it.
So you absolutely did poison the well, regardless of what the authors of the book said, because poisoning of the well occurs when we illegitimately prime our audience with a preemptive strike against, or with adverse information about, an argumentative opponent, before the latter has had a chance to say anything in her own defense, or in defense of her point of view. Just because they acknowledge their biases in the book, and acknowledge this creates dogmatic problems, still has no bearing on the truth of their argument.
1, it absolutely is not in any way, shape, or form whatsoever poisoning the well to share a thesis statement, even if the thesis statement is critical. I literally said I would argue X and Y, and then I argued X and Y, and demonstrated both X and Y from your own source. You think it is a fallacy because you seem to think that it is ad hominem to address dogmatic motivations. You repeatedly claim throughout these responses that there's something inappropriate with me talking about motivations, but that addresses the rest of this clip. First, no, they're not just sharing their biases, they're sharing their motivations and their methodologies, both of which are firmly grounded in dogmatic concerns. Without the dogmatic problem of Jesus' prophecy not coming true, this book doesn't exist. So a primary motivation for this book is that dogmatism, and there are theological dogmas wrapped up in the methodologies that they explain. They explicitly acknowledge that. So the reason that's relevant, despite your claim that it's not, is because it means that the argument of the book is only going to convince people who already agree with that set of dogmas, meaning outside of the presupposition of those dogmas, the argument doesn't work. And that's my whole point. You even accused me of engaging in ad hominem because I said we need to consider the rhetorical goals of the author in Jeremiah in interpreting what Jeremiah is saying. And I noticed you were more than happy to not even acknowledge, much less respond to my criticisms of that particular flailing about with a logical fallacy accusation to avoid having to engage actual critical scholarship and concern with the dogmatism underlying your apologetic defense.
We have more evidence of conditional prophecy than fatalistic.
So the quote you showed on the screen does not say what you said Strine observed. And I searched for your quote throughout the book, and I could not find it in whole or in any of its parts.
Which is very odd that you missed it, because I put on the screen, it's on page 57. Here's a screenshot. You can see the full quote.
So I'm just baffled at how you think this is an actual response to my argument. You claim that Strine argued we have more evidence for conditional prophecy than for fatalistic. Strine argued absolutely no such thing. No such quote appears anywhere in the book. No such sentiment is ever asserted by Strine. It is entirely unrelated to your original quote, and even when you said, no, dummy, you got to look at page 57, here's the quote, that's also entirely unrelated to the claim that we have more evidence for conditional prophecy than fatalistic. I shared the closest we get to that sentiment anywhere in the entire book, and it is Strine pointing to de Jong and Thiemeyer and saying, based on their evidence, one might come to regard conditional prophecy as the norm and fatalistic prophecy as the anomaly. But Strine never arrives at that conclusion. In the footnote, Strine says that's the conclusion they arrived at. Strine never arrives at that conclusion. So again, your claim remains not demonstrated. Nothing in the text indicates that. What you are arguing is that nothing prevents me from reading this into any prophecy where they don't add the explicit rhetorical flourish that this is irrevocable.
And I could just say you're doing the same thing in reverse. You're just assuming unconditional prophecy, unless it specifically mentions that the prophecy is conditional.
So this is a pretty textbook burden of proof fallacy. It's not my responsibility to demonstrate that prophecies that lack conditions cannot possibly be conditional prophecies. This is your argument. You brought it. It is your responsibility to demonstrate your argument, which is that these prophecies that lack conditions are actually conditional prophecies. So you've got to demonstrate that that is the most likely conclusion. And all I'm pointing out is that you have not yet demonstrated that. The argument to this point has basically been that because some prophecies are conditional, we can assume these prophecies are conditional. That's not an argument. That only works for those who already presuppose it to be the case and really want it to be the case, and so are coerced by their dogmatism to think that the argument is adequate. The argument has not yet been adequately made. So there are two reasons that we know the prophecy in Jonah was unconditional. One, no conditions were stated, so it's unconditional.
This is assuming it has to be necessarily stated in a book that's written in a high-context society, when the narrative of Jonah already spells this out for us, so it doesn't have to be directly stated.
You're absolutely right. It does not have to be explicitly stated, but it shouldn't be explicitly precluded. And in Jonah, it's explicitly precluded because the text explicitly states that God changed his mind regarding the evil that he had threatened to do to them. You don't change your mind when someone meets conditions you have set, whether those conditions are stated or unstated. If your plan the entire time has been to not do the thing if they meet your conditions, then you are not changing your mind. This is phenomenally basic logic.
If Jonah thought God was telling him to go give Nineveh an unconditional prophecy, he would have just went so he could watch the city be destroyed, which we see at the end is what he wanted. He would not have fled so that the warning could not be delivered. And this is Strine's point. The book of Jonah just assumes prophecies are conditional because that was the cultural norm. It didn't necessarily have to be stated every time. People just assumed this was the case.
But that would be an awful misreading of Jonah. It would be like the audience knowing Bruce Willis's character was dead throughout the entire M. Night Shyamalan movie. It would undermine the rhetorical impact of the big reveal because the tension has been amped up by the audience wondering, why is this idiot so reluctant to go preach destruction to the hated Assyrians? And the great reveal is when Jonah says, I knew you would change your mind. Once again, if someone offers conditions and the people meet the conditions, it is not changing your mind to not impose the penalty threatened if you don't meet the conditions. That's not what it means to change one's mind. In a conditional prophecy, you don't change your mind. You say, I'm going to do X unless you do Y.
And that's exactly what happened. God relented because they did Y. The implication is the prophecy was always thought of as conditional.
No, that's not exactly what happened because, one, God did change their mind. The text is explicit about that. The narrator states, Vayinachem ha'Elohim, God changed his mind. Second, God did not say, unless you do Y. You are insisting that that's the implication. But the fact that the narrator explicitly describes God changing their mind undermines the notion that that is the inference that we should be making there. The text is quite clearly saying God intended to go through with this, but then God's mercy overpowered their intentions. It's not because there were conditions the whole time. There were not. It's because God is merciful and God could not go through with what they intended. This reading is what was intended by the author of Jonah. That was the rhetorical goal of the author of Jonah. The reason you can't accept that is not only because it undermines your argument regarding the Olivet Discourse, but also because you dogmatically oppose the notion that God would change their mind. You can't even pretend to demonstrate that this is true about prophecy. You can only decide that it must be true about prophecy.
No, I can study the evidence from the ancient Near East in the biblical texts to see that prophecies are more often conditional, and then I can infer this is probably what an author is assuming when he writes a prophecy.
The two problems are, one, no one has ever demonstrated that conditional prophecies outnumber fatalistic prophecies. That's an assumption you've made, that you've asserted, that you've tried to substantiate by cooking up an imaginary quote that does not come from the book you are citing. And two, that inference requires overruling the very words of the author themselves and their rhetorical goals. And your only response there is to argue you're not allowed to bring up rhetorical goals because that's ad hominem. Now, I apologize, I'm going to have to save the rest for a part 2, but the fit for part 1 has been Rogue and Gambit forever.